Welcome back, everyone, to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. Our third segment of the show might be the one you all have been waiting for. I don't know. I personally have been waiting for this segment. They've all been great, though. And this one is offering a little bit of insight into how admissions officers read files. I find that people are super interested in this piece because, who knows what happens when you press submit on a college application and it flies through the interwebs and lands in someone's college admissions office, what happens when you get there. And so my colleague, Brittany Preston, who's a former admissions officer at University of Colorado Boulder, at Gonzaga, at Simpson, and at Oregon State Cascades, so has a very broad perspective on having read files, is here to join us and talk to us about that. So welcome, Brittany.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we just listed off, you've read files at four different undergraduate colleges and actually a graduate school as well, which we didn't mention. And I'm curious, was the process the same at all of them? Was it different at all of them?
Yeah, great question. A lot of things were the same. I would say the mechanics were the same. Everywhere I worked took a very holistic approach, which for our listeners, that means your application isn't going in and cutting you off based on GPA. We're looking at a lot of different factors from your activities to your essays to your, extracurriculars and your letters of rec. But the biggest differences were how quickly we reviewed a file, how important certain factors were and how much we scrutinize those factors, a lot having to do with selectivity, which I'm sure we'll get into. But, transcript was important everywhere I worked. The
Right.
way we kind of went through a sequence of looking at the factors was all very, very similar. So it was easy to go office to office because I just had to learn what were the specifics that they were honing in on.
Right. So actually, let's talk about that a little bit. The individual pieces of the application. It sounds like even the order that you went through the pieces might have been similar. I'll be curious as you walk us through your order if it matches the order at Penn, but I'm almost 99.9% positive that the very first thing you do is the very first thing that every admissions office does, and that's look at the transcript. Is that true?
That is one of the first things I look at. What our listeners may not know is a lot of colleges have like a cover sheet. So actually, I looked at that first because it gave me
Interesting.
an introduction to the student. And it's funny, I started early enough that they were paper files. So we
Me
literally
too.
had a paper stapled. But now it's an electronic system and we were able to pull up. But that gave me an overview of where are they from, what high school do they go to. It pulled a lot of the information from the Common App, but then presented a GPA. But then, yes, immediately I went to the transcript because honestly, I could read the best essay in the world, but if they didn't meet my academic standards, they weren't going to get in. And I may have spent a little bit less time on their application.
Right, right, as a result. So when you're looking at the transcript, what are you focusing on that piece of paper or
So
that file, electronic file?
yeah. So some universities I worked at, we had high acceptance rates. Worked at some big state publics where we were admitting 80% of the students who applied. So immediately I went to the GPA and then I would look, at the grade trends. What were the flow of grades? What were the rigor of classes? Some students were a clear admit and I might move really quickly at those schools. For some of the more selective schools I looked at, we might be looking at specific classes. So I'd begin to get in the weeds a little bit more. Oh, you're applying to engineering? I'm going to immediately look at what level of math you got to. I'm going to
Right.
look at did you take physics? I'm also going to look how you were doing in English and history and how were you a well-rounded student. I'm going to look at the rigor of the classes. So how many AP classes or IB classes you took within the context of your high school. One of the universities I worked at, we worked with a lot of small rural schools in Iowa, and they didn't have AP. They didn't have a huge list. And so we didn't punish a student for that.
Right.
But I definitely looked at, how many A's and B's, where were the weak spots? Some students have that one grade that just haunts them for years to come, but it was a learning opportunity and how did they bounce back from that? But a lot of families think think, oh, they're just looking at GPA. But no, we were looking at the printed copy of the transcript, going class by class, grade by grade, and looking at the whole culmination of the academic record.
Right. And at Penn, GPA was virtually irrelevant to the process because we were going exactly the way you just described. And of course, at Penn, the expectation was that students were in the most rigorous curriculum available to them, and that they were doing extraordinarily well across the board in all of their courses. And while we would definitely look a little extra closely at math and science for a student who wanted engineering, for example, or maybe at English and history for a student who was focused on English or history as a major, we were still expecting excellence across the board. And that was simply a result of having far too many qualified applicants, and far too few spots for all of them. So I think it's fair to say that the more selective you get, the more scrutiny that transcript is going to be under.
Absolutely.
But of course, in all cases, obviously at some of the schools that you worked at, the transcript was pretty much enough. And would you still review the rest of the application? How did that work for the students who easily made the cut?
Yeah, so at those institutions where we were admitting the majority of students, we did still read every piece of the application. So
Yeah.
we would quickly read through the essay, quickly look at the activities, mainly looking for red flags.
Yeah.
If there was a student that we had some concerns or clearly was kind of mocking us, that could impact their admission decision in some way. So it was quicker, but we did still look at every piece of the application.
Right. You want to make sure you're not admitting a student who says in their essay, I'm only applying because you're a safety and my parents are making me, or something
Right.
like that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I like. So take it seriously.
Yeah.
All right. So after the transcript, what pieces were you turning to next in the application?
Yeah, after the transcript, I'd kind of go through the Common App. So looking at the activity list and some of the quick facts, digging into the weeds on the background. But I was an essay lover, so I moved pretty quickly to the essay because I had a background on the student. I understood their academic preparation. Now I want to meet them. Now I want to know what makes them tick. And the essay was their voice. And what's amazing is think about it. Your Common App essay is going to your highly selective reach schools, but it's also going to your backups. We're all reading the same essay, and that's how we're getting to know you. And so that was an important piece. So I usually move to those pieces to get to know the student outside of the classroom.
So interestingly enough, when I was at Penn, I actually read the essays last.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so you could argue that at the end of the day, the make or break point came for those students who were sort of looking really competitive up to that point. Now is their time to, like you say, now it's time to actually meet the student in their own words.
Mhm.
And that was where some students absolutely cemented their case. And I thought, oh, I love this kid. I can't wait to advocate for this student in committee. Or I thought, oh, wow, that's unfortunate. I wish they had spent more time on this or written about something different or, any number of things when the essays really failed to hit the mark. So they weren't going to get in or not get in because of the essay. It was really everything that came before, but you certainly could make a better case for yourself or the reverse, depending on the quality of the essay. So
Yeah.
it is interesting, the different order sometimes that I think, and I'm not convinced that all of my colleagues read in the same way. That was just the order that I ended up. And our reader rating card did have the essay piece last, so I just kind of followed that piece.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. I follow the rhythm, follow, what the score sheet said, but I had colleagues who started with the essay because they
Interesting.
wanted to meet the student. But for me, I kind of started with the big picture.
Right, you don't want to fall in love if the big
No.
picture is going to be a really difficult to overcome. So after you read the transcript and you read the essays, what came next for you?
Then I'd usually go to like letters of recommendation and some
Mhm.
of those other supplemental pieces. And, over the years, I saw some fabulous letters of recommendation. And then I saw, a lot that just came across as this is clearly a form letter with a couple quick facts. And
Right.
I never punished a student for that because, some of these students are coming from high schools where that science teacher is writing 50 letters of
Yeah.
recommendation. But it was amazing if a letter was clearly personalized and really in depth about the student. It usually just confirmed what I was seeing in the transcript, but it allowed me to hear from somebody else what type of student they were and how
Right.
they were academically prepared for my institution.
Right.
So,
And I'm curious if you would agree that in general, I would say that recommendation letters didn't tend to be particularly brilliantly written, but strong ones gave you that information you needed, and that's mostly what you needed from them. Is that fairly accurate?
absolutely. That's
Yeah.
very accurate. Yeah.
I have students who say, well, I'd love to ask my math teacher, but he's not a native speaker and I don't think he'll be a great writer. And, I will often say, well, does he know you? Does he like you? Yes, and yes. And so do you think he will put a little bit of time into writing the letter? Yes, I do. Can you give him some things that you would love for him to mention? Yes, I can. Well, then I'm not really worried about how brilliantly written it's going to be if you are confident that he will write a letter that's going to be pretty supportive of you.
Yeah.
I rarely saw that the quality of the letter really impacted the student, so long as what was in it was helpful.
Would
Seem fair?
completely agree.
Yeah.
And I loved it. A few weeks ago on the podcast, someone said, this process is building a case. I was collecting information. I wasn't collecting negatives of, oh, it was a poorly,
Right.
I would have never said it's a poorly written letter.
Of
It's
course not.
more, the teacher said this, and this about the student. That's why I want to admit them. So it's creating that story and creating that case for the student.
Yes, I would agree. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, test scores. At what point? But that's part of. Well, tell me, at what point are you looking at those?
Usually pretty early in the review process. So it usually would have been on that cover sheet that I
Right.
mentioned that kind of gave high level. Sometimes it's printed right on the transcript so I can see it there. We're in such a unique situation now with test optional. It's looked at differently, but some schools I worked at, if you didn't have a certain score, you really kind of fell in the deny pile immediately because of that score. Whereas others, we really used all the pieces. And even if the score was low, I could make a case for that student and be admitted. It just depended on the academic program. It depended on the school.
Got it. All right. We have another minute or two. So we've kind of talked about going through the different pieces of the file. And what I would love for our listeners to take away is that regardless of selectivity, they were looking at the whole file. So they were going to go through every piece. So keep that in mind. But now it's time to make a decision. And I'm guessing that the way decisions were made probably was different from school to school. So what were some of the different ways in which the final decision got made at your schools?
Yeah, when I thought about differences, this is one of the key differences between
Yeah.
places I worked. Sometimes I was a 24-year-old and I got to press an admit button or a deny
Yeah.
button. I got to make that decision. Other schools, we made recommendations and the dean would make the decision, or the dean might come back and say, we need to deny more students or admit more students. Other situations, we'd go into a committee room. So maybe one or two readers had made a recommendation. We're going to talk about the students together. So there's a huge variety in who gets to make that final call. And I saw a little bit of it all. So
Right. And I would say at places like Penn and at other, like the more selective you get, typically, the more people are involved in the decision making process. So the
absolutely.
likelihood that a 24-year-old is saying yes and that's all that's happening becomes less and less likely the more selective the schools that you're looking
Exactly.
at.
The more selective, the more scrutiny, the more
Right.
kind of in the weeds they get. So
Which is kind of what you want, right?
mhm,
So if those spots are
absolutely.
harder to come by, you want people to be taking a closer look. Um,
Absolutely.
Brittany, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Pleasure to be here. Have a great day.
All right, you too. So thanks to Brittany, thanks to all of our guests today, all of my guests today. Next week, Sally's going to be here and she's going to be your host. We're actually going to welcome a student to the show who is in a conservatory setting. And so we're going to get that conservatory student experience. We're also going to welcome a College Coach employee who does our UX design and he's going to tell us a little bit more about his path to that career. And then in another of our New Year's resolution pieces, we're going to be talking about debt management tips. So you're not going to want to miss that. And also, don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Again, the more we get, the easier it is for others to find us. Maybe that could be a New Year's resolution. I will review the podcasts that I listen to regularly, and this is one of them. So don't forget us. And then if you have questions, you can send them to us on Facebook, via Instagram. You can follow us at collegecoachbh, or you could email those in to us at gettingin.voiceamerica@gmail.com. And don't forget, we're here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.